Morning Year 10, welcome to this Thursday's lesson for Unseen Poetry. Hope you're having a good week, and those of you who have been in school so far this week, hope you enjoyed it and it was good to be back. Lots of you are going to be in school for English lessons next week, so we'll talk more about that a little later on, but we'll start the session by reading the poem. So, I'm thinking of my father in the backyard, throwing more and more wood on the fire. As the slow dusk of summer descends, he's throwing more wood on the fire, as his brother lies dying. But then I think, aren't we all dying? But he knows, my uncle, he knows what will kill him. A tumour the size of a fist and growing. And still my father throws wood on the fire, as the new cherry blossom tree waits to be planted. He throws wood on the fire, while my mother sits and watches TV, and outside the fire gets higher. My father cuts wood with a saw that screams as if someone is dying, and he doesn't care about splinters or safety as long as the fire gets higher. And all the stone lions and grave little gnomes in their cheerful red breeches are waiting for the fire to falter, and the lamp that's addicted to heat flickers on, flickers off, and the lawn sits in its shadows and dark and its falsehoods, and the ending begins with its terrible face, its strange way of being, its short way of living, and my father stops throwing wood on the fire. Okay, so that poem is by Kim Moore, and it was in her book The Art of Falling, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago. What I want to do today is, often in these videos, I look at some of the questions you've asked, but in the first half today I want to ask you some questions. And the first one is to do with what's definitely the main symbol in this poem, which is the fire. So I want you to think about, what does the fire in this poem represent? And lots of you have been thinking about that already, because it's mentioned in a lot of the comments that you've been sending in over the last couple of days. Fire is one of those images or symbols which comes up a lot in literature, and depending on the context, of course, fire can be something positive. It keeps you warm. It's a source of protection. It's a means to food and survival, but fire can also be destructive, and so in that way a negative image. Fire is also used sometimes to represent passion or anger or lots of other human emotions. So it's got all these different possible meanings, and our task really in interpreting the poem is to say which of those meanings are the most important here. The other thing that one or two of you might have thought of is that over the last few weeks we've done a few different poems, and a few weeks ago we looked at the poem Those Winter Sundays, and that poem also used an image of fire. And today, for I'm thinking of my father, I've used this fire here outside as dusk falls. A few weeks ago, you might remember in the video I used this image for the fire that the father had started in the house. So two fires in those two poems, but they seem to me to have different properties. This was representing the father's love and care for his son. Here, the father's love is going into this fire in one way or another, but it seems much less positive and protective and safe in this poem. And one of the things about the unseen poetry part of the exam, I guess, is the more poems that you've read, the more that you can make these mental connections. And that might be something that is useful to do in your answer. You can say, right, here in this poem, a central image is fire. And as well as talking about what the fire in the poem means to you, you can also say about what might that symbol mean elsewhere. So you could, for example, and it's only one example, but you could say, elsewhere in literature, fire is often seen as a symbol of protection and warmth, and even the coziness of a family home. Whereas here, the fire is more dangerous and unpredictable and threatening, and tied in with the possibly impending death of the uncle. So by talking about what the symbol can mean when it's used in another context, you can illuminate what it means here, perhaps. And that's something you can think about generally when you're reading the poem. How have I seen, or any type of text, how have I seen this image used elsewhere? Okay, so that's one question I want you to think about during the lesson today. A couple of others here, if PowerPoint will allow. Here we go. Yeah, why is the daughter the voice of this poem? Who's the poem about? It seems to be about the father. I'm thinking of my father, and the father certainly seems to be the main actor or protagonist in the poem. He's the one that's building the fire, and we're watching him do that. But is it about him, or is it about his brother, the speaker's uncle, who's dying, who has a tumour? We never see him, but his illness seems to provide the context for everything that happens. So we could talk about the poem as being about the uncle, we could talk about it as being about the father. Neither of them are the speaker in the poem, the daughter is. Why is this? And is the poem in any meaningful way about her? Something to think about. Another question, why is this poem in the present tense? It seems that perhaps either the poet has invented a story, a scenario, and if we read stories as in novels, often they're recounted in the past tense, or if this is based on her real life and her family's real life, she's recounting a memory, which again we would expect to be in the past tense. So why the present tense? So 3 questions there about this poem, and like I say, you may have already grappled with certainly the first and possibly the others as well when you've read it in the lesson earlier in the week. But actually, I'd just like you to pause the video there and give yourself a chance to have a think again about those 3 questions. You're very welcome to jot down notes if you wish, but most importantly I want you to pause the video here, have a think about those 3 questions, and then press play again and listen to the rest in a few moments. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about those questions, and another thing it might actually be fruitful to do is to change it. Could you rewrite the poem from the point of view of the father or the mother or the uncle? Could you rewrite the poem in the past tense? What difference would it make? So just briefly, I'll give some of my ideas on those 2 questions, and then we'll return to the question of the fire. The daughter is the voice of the poem. Well, the writer is a woman, so if she's writing about her own family history, it makes sense for it to be from her own perspective. So it may be something as simple as that. But at the same time, I'm sure, even if that's the case, she would have thought through that and thought, well, would it be more effective to write from the point of view of the father if the father is what's being examined in this poem? Well, I guess the father in the poem feels in some way helpless. The daughter has less agency than the father. The father is building this fire almost to feel like he's doing something, but the fire, we know, can't keep his brother alive. Perhaps by the daughter speaking but taking no action in the poem, that idea of helplessness, which along with bereavement and pain and the shortness of life is one of the ideas in the poem, the idea of helplessness might be foregrounded by having a speaker who is entirely passive in the poem. Or it might make us think about when someone is suffering, is clearly the father in the poem is suffering, what happens to the family members? Are they isolated? Are they neglected? Are they forgotten? Why the present tense? Well, I think it gives us a sense of immediacy. I sometimes think when you write in the present tense, it makes what you're describing easier for the reader to imagine. It's happening now, it's more vivid. And I think it also links to something that one of you said in a comment that was emailed in, that there's something about brevity. Present tense, this is a moment, then it's gone. And the fire is flickering, and the life of the uncle is coming to an end. And by putting it in the present tense, maybe the shortness of life is somehow emphasised in that way. One more possibility about that. It is the memory and looking back, but rather than the past tense, it's still in the present tense. Does it say something about the vividness of the memory, the importance of that memory, that it hasn't faded into the past, it's still there in the present. Okay, well, what about this fire? Well, lots of you, in fact, nearly half of you probably in one way or another mentioned or asked about the poem, about the fire in your comments on the poem. So I'll just go through a few of these now. This first one I think touches on something important. The fire could be a metaphorical thing while also being literally there. Yeah, it's both. Clearly, in the story of the poem, the fire is being built in the garden by the father. There's no suggestion that's not happening. It is, but then it has extra meanings or resonances as well. Here's some of them, and by all means pause the video here, give yourself more time to read these. This first student suggests when he's throwing wood onto the fire, he's feeding his anger. And we've seen fire in other places as a symbol for anger, having fire in your belly, well, being aflame with anger, and so on. Well, the wood feeds the fire, the anger grows, he's angry with the situation, but by building the fire is only adding to that. Second one's similar. The wood is depression and anger, he's trying to get rid of it. And this person says, well, you only end up with ashes, and that's still potentially a symbol for depression. And linking to the first comment, of course, you don't get rid of, you might get rid of the wood, but actually the fire grows by burning these things. Perhaps they're only being intensified. It's not working. A different one, the third one. The father was the light of life. So the fire in this idea is not the father's emotions, but the father himself. A more positive view, warmth, love, and affection. Fourthly, the fire is a metaphor for him being ill. Well, the fire could be a metaphor for the illness of the brother, or for a sort of mental illness or suffering of the father. Because of this, the father doesn't care about safety. At one view, he doesn't care what sort of pain happens, what treatment is needed, as long as the brother gets to live another day. And a few of you commented along similar lines. The fire represents a dying brother. He's building up the fire because in his mind he almost feels that's the way to prolong the life of the brother. He desperately wants the brother to live. I like the one about the instability of life. Think of a fire, sort of, it's powerful, but it's also flickering and it's temporary, and the wood is eventually burnt up. And this student suggests, well, that emphasises something about how short life actually is. Eventually the fire burns out, and there's nothing we can do about that. Another student looking at anger and resentment, and finally this idea, and we have, I think, seen, I guess, fire can represent lots of strong emotions, and the last one a student I've quoted here, although other students had a similar idea, is this fire represents that love for the brother. So all these different things that one symbol can represent, and you're not expected to draw out all of those. What's important is your interpretation, and any of the bullet points on these last two slides, any of these things that these students have said would quite comfortably sit in a grade 8 or 9 answer. Okay, so yes, in the story of the poem the fire is burning, but you might talk about why is he burning that fire? Is it to take his mind off what's happening? Is it to feel like he's doing something? Is it in some way to symbolise or represent to people a cry for help? So there's that sort of literal thing of why is he burning the fire, and as the first student says, at the same time the metaphorical thing of what might the fire make us think of or represent. Okay, so in the second half of the video we'll look at some other details in the poem, but hopefully that gives you sort of some insights into writing about a really central symbol in a poem. I will see you shortly for part 2.